to another video. Today it is the sew along for the 8167, which is a McCalls pattern. So this style is definitely massively outside of my comfort zone. It's a trapeze style dress. I featured it in a Get the Look for Less video as a possible starting point for a dupe for the Pilotto dress that I found on Net-a-Porter. I really liked this dress. I probably wouldn't have bought this dress even if I had the money, because it was slightly too short for me and there were a few things that weren't quite right with it, but I did think the 8167 was a really good jumping off point to get something similar, and I'm really happy with my results, so much so that I've actually made two of them. So I put it up for a vote on Patreon because I thought, you know what, I'm doing all these Get the Look for Less videos, let's put my time and a certain amount of money where my mouth is and see if I can actually make some of these things look like the inspiration images or dresses or pieces of clothing that I'm finding on these really expensive websites. So I put it up for a vote on Patreon and the peeps overwhelmingly voted for the McCalls 8167, and I'm really glad they did because I actually really like these dresses. As I say, dresses, I've made two of them. This is a very easy pattern to make. It's a level 2 learn to sew pattern according to their branding. They've nicknamed it the Martina McCalls as well. To start with, I was going to be all gung-ho and cut out some of my precious to me, can't be replaced crinkle floral navy viscose to try and get something similar-ish to the Pilotto dress. And I just had this little bit of fear that it was like, hang on a minute, I might not actually like this dress, let's do it in something that's replaceable. So I picked out one of my solid fabrics, of which I have a few, but I don't have that many. The majority of stuff that I buy tends to be print and patterns and flowers and leaves, because we all know how I feel about those. I picked out the rust coloured crinkle viscose that I got from the fabric room. Unfortunately that one is no longer available, which is sad because it is such a lovely colour and I would like some more of it to make a shirt, but never mind. Once I picked my fabric, I then started working on the pattern. Now, we all know how I feel about pattern envelopes. According to the back of this envelope, I should be cutting out a size large for a 38 to 40 inch bust, a size medium for a 26 to 28.5 inch waist, and then a size extra large for a 44 to 46 inch hip. All of the sizes come in this. This goes from extra small to extra large, so it's a really small size range in this as well. I ignored this completely. I went and had a look at the finished garment measurements, which you'll see in the sew along. I ended up cutting out a small, which is supposed to be for a 31.5 to 32.5 inch bust. I believe that it would ended up as a 40 inches around the bust. I'm really glad that I did because, as I say, this is really outside of my comfort zone, and I wanted to give myself the best chance of liking this, and I thought if it's tent-like right from the top all the way down, I'm not going to like it. So I wanted some fitting and shaping over my bust. I'm really glad that I went for the size small. It's slightly too short on my shoulders, but we're talking by maybe 1/4 of an inch, so I get away with it. The fit over my bust I really like, and then as long as I cinch it in at the waist, I love how this looks. Now, I made fabric ties for both of the dresses. I've worn it with other belts from my collection as well. I do love a belt, as you all know. I really like how these look belted. Unbelted, I feel like they look like nightgowns, and that's not to say that that's not a good look for other people. Just for me, I like to emphasize that I have shaping at my waist. I like to emphasize that I'm an hourglass figure, so that's why I will always cinch these in at the waist if I ever wear them. The other thing to bear in mind is that it was the middle of winter when I started making these, and because I made my burgundy one last year, I think in December, then I've made this one in January. So it was the dead of winter and there is absolutely zero chance of me wearing these things with short sleeves. So I have added on the sleeves from the McCalls 7537. These are some of my favourite sleeves ever. They are bishop sleeves, blouson at the wrist. They have elastication in them, which means that you can wear them either pulled up or you can wear them at your wrists. I had slightly too much on the side of caution with these ones and made the elastic slightly too long, so I'm going to have to go in and just shorten it ever so slightly because they do fall down from here. Yeah, I measured it over a jumper, which was stupid. Don't do that. But yeah, I'm really pleased that I have put these sleeves on because I don't think I would actually want a short sleeve version of this. I have other summer dresses that I like more, but I do really like this one because I can add layers underneath of it to keep me warm in the cooler months, and then going into spring I shall continue to wear these ones with tights and sometimes cardigans over the top. But yeah, it's a nice dress. I have worn this one out a couple of times while I was up in London last. It's a nice dress. It's a really pretty dress. It's a really good starting point. Like I say, it's a level 2 learn to sew pattern. The back of the envelope suggests cotton blends, linen, challis and staple knits, and it says it needs snaps for dress C and D because they have like the faux neckline that goes around, so you need to be able to snap it at the front so that you can get your head in and out. I filmed all the process of making the burgundy dress and absolutely hated the facing. Even with tacking it down, stay stitching, under stitching, pressing, doing all the things that you're meant to do, it still kind of wanted to flip out and flop out, and the neckline wasn't looking great. It was okay. I hated it. I was just like, no, I don't want to show you guys how to do this because I don't like the finish of it, and if I don't like the finish of something I don't want to put it out as a sew along. So I got around that one by doing decorative top stitching around the neck edge and then the bottom hem to mirror that, because I did put a ruffle on this dress to make it look more like the Pilotto one. That's a mouthful. So once I decided I wasn't going to show you guys how to do that one, I had to come up with a solution for finishing the neck edge of this dress, and lining it, fully lining it, you could totally do if you wanted to, but you really don't need to. So I drafted an all-in-one facing. I show you how to do that in the sew along. I will also show you how to sew that in nice and cleanly so you have a clean finish on the inside of your garment as well. And that is probably the only tricky part of making this dress, is just finishing off the armholes of the facing so that everything is cleanly finished on the inside. I am so glad that I redid it because I much prefer this neckline. Much prefer it. It's sitting a lot flatter, it's doing as it's told, and I'm not having to roll it back underneath all the time and worry about it flipping out and misbehaving. And I did tack the other one down, like I said, I did all the things you're meant to do. I just don't like facings. I really don't like facings, but you need to finish necklines somehow. For me, usually I would prefer to fully line a bodice, but as I say, that isn't really an option with this one. You'd have to fully line the entire dress, and I really didn't want or need to use that much fabric for this one. So I was looking for a floral print like the Peter Pilotto. I kind of was decided that I needed to buy a new one because I didn't have anything in my stash. And then when I had a proper clear out, I think it was a hangout on one of the Sundays or something, but I remembered that I had nearly 8 meters of this fabric that the very lovely Fanny got me from Spain. She'd put it up on her Instagram. I messaged her immediately and just went, oh, that's beautiful. She was like, I thought you'd like it. And I sent her the money and she got me the fabric. And there was a fault in the fabric. There was like a print fault 10 centimeters in on one side on about 3.5 meters of the fabric. I'd paid for 5 and I ended up getting 7.5 meters, and that last sort of like 2.5 was free, which was awesome. I still have about 4 meters of this fabric left to make another dress, but I am really glad that I used it for this one because I think it's really pretty and similar-ish to the Peter Pilotto dress. Again, that one has actual integral waist ties, which I did consider doing, but it would also then limit it to that's the only way you could wear it. Whereas by making the fabric ties, as I have done for this dress, it means that I can put on either the fabric belt or a elasticated belt that I like, or a leather belt. I have lots of different options in my wardrobe, so it was nice. I thought, you know, that would give me more versatility. Obviously I've added the long sleeves as well because of the time of year that I was making this dress. Will I make this dress again? Probably. I probably will. I do enjoy wearing it. I think it is a different silhouette for me. I think it's kind of a much more relaxed silhouette. As I say, will never wear this not belted because I do not like how it looks on me not belted, but with the belts on I really enjoy wearing this dress, and as I say, I have worn it out a few times. So yes, I will make another one of these, although it's not super high up on my list to do because I have so many favourite dresses that I've made multiple times and then so many new patterns to try. But I'm keeping the pattern, I'm keeping my tracing, and I definitely will make it again in the future at some point. On to the sew along. I'm going to talk you through choosing your size. I'm going to talk you through tracing the pattern. I didn't actually do any alterations to this one, as in like add length to the bodice, because of the shape of the dress, so I won't talk you through any of those, but I will show you how I added on the all-in-one facing and the making the ruffle and the tie, and then I personally smooshed on sleeves from the McCalls 7537 because I really like those sleeves. You can pretty much smoosh on any sleeves that have enough kind of gathering at the top. That's my secret is for smooshing on sleeves, is if they have gathering at the top you can make them fit into the arm side of pretty much anything. At least that is what I have found in my trial and error of literal smooshing. I have no rhyme or reason for, you know, I have no technical knowledge of how I make these work. I just smoosh and hope for the best, and so far so good. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is iron your tissue paper nice and flat. The next thing that you want to do is go through the pattern piece list and work out what you want to trace. So I'm doing view A basically, but view A is like double-sided colours, which I'm not doing, but I am doing that silhouette. So I want the front. I don't like pockets in my dresses, these kinds of dresses, and I'm going to make this out of a really lightweight viscose. The pattern recommends cotton blends, linen, challis and stable knits. Stable knits. I'm going to be making mine in a lightweight viscose. I don't want pockets in that, so I'm not going to do pocket piece, which is number 2. So I'm going to do the front, the back, the front neck facing and the back neck facing for A and B. And for my winter version I am actually going to be doing a full long bishop sleeve because I do like that. I am going to trace the sleeve pattern piece 8 to have a look at the sleeve cap, but I'm probably going to substitute in the 7537 sleeve because I love that one. Now, as you know, I am making this dress to kind of look like this Pilotto dress. On the model C here, it's actually looking like it's quite high on her, but the Pilotto dress is actually even higher at the front. So I'm going to raise up the front curve of my pattern piece, which is this curved piece here. I'm going to raise that up even more, and I'm going to substitute in the ruffle. I am going to do a straight ruffle. I'm not going to do any shaping whatsoever. It depends on the length of the skirt once I've worked out how far up I'm going to go, but it is going to be quite a deep ruffle. This one looks like it's maybe sort of 12 inches, 30 centimeters. So I'm going to go for that, but I do want it to just cover my knees. I want it to be a bit longer than this one. But I do think the proportion of adding the ruffle in will still mean that I'm going to bring up the front of my skirt, my front bodice piece or front dress piece, because I think that proportion will look better. I hope that makes sense. Especially, I don't know, just, yeah, because I mean when you put the knees next to each other I realise that I appreciate that they're not kind of like the same scale, but the ruffle is kind of like low hip that it's starting at the front there. So I'm going to need to do some amending for that. And this actually just has a straight V-neck, whereas this one has kind of like a notched neck. So I'm going to just straighten that out as well. So I'm going to be doing quite a lot of alterations to this, but they're all fairly minor. So now that I've worked out which pieces I want to trace and what kind of things I'm going to do to them, I need to work out what size I need to trace. So my bust is 38 inches, which puts me in the large. My waist is 28, which puts me in the medium, and my hips are 44, which put me in the extra large. And I have the bundle that does all of the sizes, which is nice. Now I don't need to worry about the hips too much because actually they're fairly free. But the size large is 38 to 40 inches. The finished garment measurements are on pattern piece number 1, and the apex is marked, and the large has a 47 inch finished measurement for the bust, which is too much for me, way too much. And when we look at the Pilotto dress, it's breezy. There is, you know, there's ease, wearing ease in there, but it's way more kind of fitted. So I'm actually going to go for the size small for the bust, which is a finished garment measurement of 39.5 inches, which will give me a 1.5 inches. The reason I'm going for this one is because the size medium is 43 inches, which would give me 5 inches of ease at the bust, and there just isn't that here. I don't want that here, so I'm going to go for the size small. And then at the waist, the size small is 49 inches for the waist of this dress, which, you know, it is a trapezoid shaped dress, so that's fine. Yeah, so I'm just going to trace a straight size small, and that's going to give me hopefully a nice blouson effect when I bring in the waist with the ties. I'm thinking maybe I have bitten off more than I can chew here, but we shall see. So yeah, I think straight size small and as I say, I'm going to substitute in the sleeves from the 7537. There are finished garment measurements on the size small sleeve, 13.5 inches, which would be a fairly tight fit on me because my arm at the moment is 13 inches, so it's only half an inch of wearing ease there, and they're definitely meant to be slightly more roomy than that. It's probably going to be quite unlikely that I am going to make a short sleeve version of this, because this to me, believe it or not, kind of screams autumn winter dress, because I'd want to wear it with like over the knee boots. Yeah, in my head. We'll see. You never know, I may love it. I may make myself one for the summer in a lighter fabric, because I'm picturing this in a dark navy fabric as well. So yeah, that's why I'm thinking autumn winter, and we are obviously in autumn winter at the moment. So I'm going to get my pieces traced out, these pieces traced out, and I'm going to cross them off as I go. As you can see, I've been doing a few piece tracings today, and I like to cross my pieces off as I go so that I don't miss anything, because I have done that in the past and it's really frustrating. I'm going to cross these out as I've gone through, trace a size small, and we're going to go from there. Okay, as I mentioned, this is one that I'm going to have to do a few alterations to, although I have just measured from the waist to the bottom edge, and it's actually 18 inches, which is a good 2 inches above my knee, which is what it looks like on the envelope. But the Pilotto one, I would say the edge of the ruffle starts maybe kind of like here, but then the ruffle comes above the knee as well, and I don't want the ruffle to be above the knee. I kind of like the idea of this being something that I can wear with my knee-high boots and they be covered, the top of them be covered. So I'm actually going to leave it the length that it is, and I'm going to try it on before I put the ruffle on, and I can always shorten it afterwards if I want to, but I'm going to leave the hem as it is. I have measured the hem, so it's 25.5 inches from edge to edge on the front, and the back is 18 inches from edge to edge, and that way I can work out how wide I'm going to need to make my ruffle, because I want it to be twice as wide as the hem of the skirt so that I can gather it in to make it look nice, which is great because it means I don't have to do anything to this area. And the next thing I need to do is straighten out the neckline, because at the moment it has like that rounded neck that then goes into a point, and I don't want that. I want it to be straight down from the shoulder. So I'm literally from the bottom of the neck dart to the point, just going to draw a line, and I'm going to cut that off. And when I traced out my facing, I didn't actually cut the facing out because I knew I was going to be amending the neckline, so I'm going to do exactly the same thing to my facing as I've just done to the neckline, which is from the bottom of the dart to the point is draw a line. And before I cut this out, I will just make sure that they actually do match up. But I'm going to cut this bit off here and then obviously make the facing match up. I have my sleeve here. Now, this sleeve I love. It's very full and much fuller than the sleeve cap I have going on. But if I lay over the kind of double notches, it's the same shape at the front and the back as this sleeve. So there's a lot more gathering that goes into the sleeve head here, so it is a lot wider than the original sleeve, but this will fit, and I have found that I can smoosh this sleeve onto very many things, and I really like how it looks. And like I say, I want to be able to wear this now, so that's why I'm using this bigger sleeve. And this is from the 7537, which there's a sew along for as well. As you can see, I've added 2 inches to the length of it as well, because I want it to be down to my wrists. So I'm going to get the rest of my facing cut out, and then we can start cutting out some fabric. Okay, we're back for round 2. So my initial one, I really like the dress. I really hate the facing. I got around it by using decorative stitching to hold the facing down, and it looks really nice, but not everybody has that option on their sewing machine, and I don't know that I would like it on a printed fabric, which is the one that I'm going to use for the next version that I make of this. So I'm going to attempt to draft an all-in-one facing. So we've got the bodice front here, and I'm going to put in my seam allowance just to make my life a little bit easier, because the facing that comes with the pattern is actually cut on the fold. So we've got, the facing comes to about here. I want to make it so it's an all-in-one facing. So I am going to, and again, I have no idea if this is correct. I am kind of going by what I have seen other facings look like. So I'm going to go 3 inches That's 1.25 inches. Yeah, 3 inches down on my side seam and make a mark. So I've gone from the underarm seam down 3 inches and I've made a mark, and we want to kind of connect those two marks, and we want it to be a curved line because we don't want our facing piece to be too prominent. I don't want like a ridge, and I didn't get a ridge underneath with this one, and I faced my facing, which I will show you how to do. So I'm hoping that's going to work. So that's literally the front facing drafted. I'm going to trace this out, but I need to make a back facing that's going to match up with it. So again, our back facing piece looks like this. Didn't like it, want it to stay inside. And my theory is that this one is going to stay inside because it's going to be sewn in at the armhole as well as at the neckline and tacked down at the front point. So I have literally matched up the back armhole with the front armhole, and I'm going to just continue because we obviously need those to meet up. You can obviously, if you don't have room to put your pattern pieces together like that, measure down 3 inches from the underarm seam like we did with the front. The other facing finishes there, but we don't want that. We're going to just, and again, we want to kind of curve it, so you want it to be flat there so it meets up. And I'm going to aim for the 3 notches on the back of my pattern piece, and I want to, when you get to that piece, you want it to be flat because that's going to be cut on the fold as well. So we need to take out the seam allowance. So let's draw in our seam allowance, which is 5/8 of an inch. So I'm going to draw that in along the centre back seam, and we want to cut this facing piece on the fold. So we want the line that kind of gets to the place where it's going to be cut on the fold to be straight, because otherwise you'll end up with a weird jog in it. So you want straight from there, and then you're going to curve it around. And again, when we're going to cut this one on the fold, we want this piece here to be straight. So I have literally eyeballed this. I have no idea if this is going to work or not. I really hope it will. I think it will. I'm willing to give it a try. So like I said, what I'm going to do is now trace out these two pieces, put in all the markings, notches, dots, and cut on the fold lines and all those kinds of things, and I'll show you what those pieces look like once I'm done. Okay, so I have my 2 new pattern pieces here, and we are going to lay them over the back and front big pattern pieces so you can kind of see what I'm aiming for. So I have literally traced it out, but as I say, it's cut on the fold, so I have taken off the seam allowance because this back one has a centre back seam, and here is my front facing piece, and again I've taken off the seam allowance along the front because this one is going to be cut on the fold, but the front piece is cut with the centre front seam because the grain line is different to the centre front seam. So now that I have got those pattern pieces drafted, I can now cut out my fabric. Okay, looking at this again, I think this is directional. I think whilst these little red lilies are both the right way up and upside down, I think the rest of it looks better with that the top and this is the bottom. Do you know what? I don't think it actually does matter. So I think what I will do is I will cut the front pieces out so that that's the top and this is the bottom, and then if I need to nest the back pieces, I can always do that. And I have also folded it with the fault up so I can see where the fault is, so I can avoid it as much as possible because it's only on one side, it's not on both sides, which is great. I'm also not going to worry if a little bit of the fault creeps into the bottom of the skirt panels because they are really full, and I think it's not going to look too bad. It's not going to be like it's not a really wide one, so I think I'm going to get away with it. We shall see. Let's start cutting this out. Okay, now because of the fault that I've got going through the fabric, I was going to cut these two facing pieces on the fold, and to do that I would need to move the back piece over and put the two facing pieces on the fold there. But if I put the back piece over, I end up with a line, a white line going right all the way through this part of the side panel, which I can avoid. So I am going to place the back piece over here outside of the fold, and then I'm going to put the facing pieces on it, and I am going to cut those out with extra seam allowance so I can seam them down the front. There's a centre front seam and a centre back seam, so it's not going to add too much bulk. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. Okay, so hopefully you've just watched me cut out the pattern pieces for this dress. And once you have got all of your front and back panels cut out, your facings and your sleeves, whatever you've got left, you're going to want to divide it up into pieces for your ruffles. I actually had a little bit more of this fabric, so I have done my ruffles 10 inches deep, and I've cut 4 of them. I did 3 last time, and 3 did work, and that's 140 centimeters wide, the full width of the fabric. But I wanted that extra floofiness on this one, so I have cut 4 10-inch strips, and the way that I have done that is I've actually torn them. So I've measured with my ruler along the selvage, measured 10 inches, made a mark, cut into it, and then ripped it so that I definitely have straight edges. I know not everybody likes to do it like that, but especially with the viscose, I find that that's my best bet for getting a properly straight edge. So I've got 4 10 by the full width of the fabric strips for the bottom ruffle. I've also cut 2 5-inch wide full length strips of the fabric. Well, I've torn them as well, and I'm going to use these to make a belt. You don't have to do this, and you can totally use a kind of ready to wear belt, or you don't have to belt your dress at all. I prefer this dress belt. In fact, I won't wear this dress without a belt on it, because if I feel like it looks like a Victorian nightgown. Not in a bad way, that's not a bad thing, it's just not my style, so I prefer to wear mine belted. So I'm going to make a fabric belt from the same fabric, and as I say, 2 5-inch wide, 2 5-inch deep, 140 inch wide, 140 inch, wow, 2 5-inch deep and 140 centimeter wide strips of fabric, and I'm going to sew those together and then sew them in half to make myself a really long fabric belt, which allows me to be able to tie it in a multitude of ways. Okay, so now that that's all cut out and prepped, we can get to sewing. We need interfacing first, but once that's done we can get to sewing. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to work on is the facings. Now, as you know, I wanted to cut them on the fold, but I didn't have enough fabric to do that and not have the fault of the fabric be visible on the outside. So I have cut them with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I'm going to sew the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance shut, and I'm going to do it with the right sides together, because this doesn't need to be a French seam, because once they're seamed together and pressed open, I'm then going to sew on the interfacing to face the facing, and it will enclose all of the raw edges. So I am going to take my front facing piece and sew it together along that front small edge. And as I say, my seam allowance I've allowed myself is 5/8 of an inch, because that's the standard for this pattern. So I'm going to sew this one at 5/8 of an inch and do the same for the back facing along this long back edge. So once the front seam and the back seam are sewn together, I can then attach the side seams together. Then we can go and press all of the seams open. So now that I've got the facing sewn together at the centre front, centre back and side seams, I am leaving the shoulder seams undone for now. So the next thing that I'm going to do is take my facing pieces that I have cut on the fold, and I'm going to sew these right sides together, and the right side is the non-sticky side, at the side seams. So we're going to sew the side seams together at 5/8 of an inch, and it's basically going to end up looking like these, but except for the centre front and centre back seams. So I'll get these off of the pattern pieces. Okay, so as I say, right sides together, and the right side is the non-sticky side, and it's the smooth side. The sticky side is kind of rough. I'm using interfacing that I got from Susan as a gift, and it's all the way from Australia. Susan very kindly sent me 20 meters of this, so I have this for a while, but I will be replacing it all the way from Australia because this stuff is just so lovely, and I've not found anything in the UK that's as light and nice as this. So I'm pinning the side seams together, and I'll sew those at 5/8 of an inch. Now obviously you don't press these open, you're going to finger press these open, because if you go and try and press these open you're going to make a mess of your iron, and we don't want to do that. Matching up the side seams, and we're going to sew both of those side seams at 5/8 of an inch. Okay, so sewing them at 5/8 of an inch. So now we need to put these together around the bottom edge, and we are going to put them together with the right sides together, and we are going to sew at 1/4 of an inch the whole way around the bottom edge. Now you want to make sure that you're getting the back lined up with the back and the front lined up with the front. So I'm going to get this pinned around the perimeter, and as I say, we're going to sew this at 1/4 of an inch. Okay, so I have sewn the facing and interfacing together, right sides together, sorry, at 1/4 of an inch, and I'm now going to go around and trim that seam with my pinking shears just to reduce bulk and kind of clip into any corners, so that I can turn the interfacing to the right side, well, I mean round to the wrong side, so that I can then press it into place. And as I say, there are corners here, so I want to make sure that it's going to lie nice and flatly. So this is a nice way of kind of clipping into and notching any curves, not corners, curves. And hopefully we won't end up with a edge that's too bulky, because we don't want a bulky edge to be showing on our garment. So I'm going to go around the whole way with my pinking shears and trim this seam allowance down. Okay, I've got all of the excess trimmed off with the pinking shears. So I am now going to take this over to the ironing board, and we need to wrap the interfacing around to the wrong side, so that the wrong sides are together, and then press it into place. And I'm going to do this really carefully to make sure that nothing gets squiffy, make sure that the seam allowances are nice and flat where there are seam allowances, and just get this all pressed into place so that the facing is then interfaced. We can then sew the shoulder seams together. Okay, so you should end up with something that looks like this. So we've got a nice neat finished edge on the edge of our facing, and everything is nicely interfaced. So I am now going to sew the shoulder seams together at 5/8 of an inch, press those open, and then we can put our facing aside until we need it to finish the neckline of our dress when the dress is ready. So I'm going to pin these together, the shoulder seams together, and sew at 5/8 of an inch, press the seams open, and then put this to the side. The first step of the instructions is to interface the facing pieces. As I mentioned, I'm doing mine very differently because I didn't like the original interfacing pieces, so I've just shown you how to do those. The next one is we want to sew the front and back seam together on the front and back panels, because we have 2 of each. So I'm going to sew those with a French seam. I have my back panel here, and I'm going to sew the centre back seam with a French seam, which means that I'm going to pin it with the wrong sides together like this. So the wrong sides are together. I'm going to pin and then sew at 1/4 of an inch. I will then trim it down to about 1/8 of an inch, press it with the right sides together, sew at 3/8 of an inch, and press that seam, and that will finish off all the raw edges. So we've got the back panels here. We're going to sew the centre back seam at 1/4 of an inch with the wrong sides together first, so that we can start the French seam. So I've got my centre back seam sewn up at 1/4 of an inch. I like to do as many things as possible before I have to get up to go to the ironing board. So I'm going to sew the centre front seam in the same manner, and also the side seams. I can sew the shoulder seams at the usual 5/8 of an inch in the usual manner, because the facing is going to cover those. So just to recap, I am going to sew the centre front seam at 1/4 inch with the wrong sides together. Then I'm going to sew the side seams at 1/4 inch with the wrong sides together. Trim everything, press everything, and then sew everything down to enclose the raw edges. Okay, as I mentioned, I am going to sew the shoulder seams in the usual manner. So I've got the right sides together and I'm going to sew them at 5/8 inch. Then I'm going to go around and trim all the excess from the French, or the beginning of the French seams that I've sewn. But like I say, I'm going to get these shoulder seams sewn at 5/8 inch with the right sides together. I'm going to trim down all of the seams that I've sewn so that they are just under 1/8 inch, ready for pressing. And I'm going to do that for the two side seams, centre front and centre back seam. Now that I have French seam spaghetti, I am going to go and press all of those seams. So I want to turn it so that the right sides are together, and I'm going to press each of these seams nice and crisply so that I can finish off the French seam by sewing them right sides together at 3/8 inch. I'm also going to press the shoulder seams open because, as we know, I have sewn those in a regular manner at 5/8 inch. I have sewn all of the French seams at just under 3/8 inch. I'm going to press the side seams towards the back, and I'm going to press the front and back seam to the left, just because I have to pick a direction and left seems like the right one. So I'm going to go and get that done. I also need to, now the main body of the dress is done, I need to work on the sleeves. So as you know, I have smooshed on, or I am going to smoosh on, the sleeves from the McCalls 7537. Now there are some marks that I need to transfer over to the sleeves. These two small circles, this is where you put the gathering stitches in. So I'm going to transfer these marks over to the top of the sleeve cap. I am then going to put the gathering stitches in, and then I will French seam the sleeves together. I'll go and give these sleeves a press first though, because they have got creased since I have cut them out. So I'm going to go press this flat, then put the marks on, then we can start actually sewing our sleeves. Okay, so I've run 2 lines of gathering stitches around from mark to mark along the cap of my sleeve. I've done it 3/8 inch away from the raw edge and 3/8 inch away from that, which does mean that this line of stitching is visible on the garment. So you want to make sure that your fabric will recover from having sewing put through it and holes put through it. This one does. Well, now that I've got the sleeve caps gathered, or the gathering stitching into the sleeve caps, I can now sew up the side seams, and I'm going to do that with French seams, of course. So I am going to pin the side seams of the sleeve, or the underarm seam of the sleeve together, wrong sides together, and sew it together at 1/4 inch. And I'm going to do that for both sleeves. Side seams have been sewn at 1/4 inch. I have trimmed off the excess. I'm now going to go and press these with the right sides together so that I can sew the final part of the French seam at 3/8 inch, or just under. Then I'm going to press these seams towards the front, because I've pressed the side seams of the dress towards the back, so that I can nest these seams when I come to sew them in. Okay, so I have finished off the French seam on the underarm seam, and as I say, I've pressed it towards the front. I've then done a row of guide stitching 3/8 inch away from the raw edge of the bottom of the sleeve. So I'm going to go and press that up, and then I'm going to press it over again to create the channel for the elastic for the bottom of the sleeve. I just like to put in a line of guide stitching so that I get an accurate turn. If you can do it by eye, you don't necessarily need to do this step, but I just find it makes it a little bit easier. So I'm going to go and press this up and up again, and then we can get that top stitch down, leaving a small opening to put the elastic through. I have pressed up the edge twice, and I have top stitched it into place, and I have left myself a little gap so that I can get the elastic through. Now I like to put my elastic around my kind of like upper forearm, because I want to be able to push the sleeve of my dress up to this point, and I want it to be comfortable. So I'm wrapping it around and overlapping it by about 1 inch, and I'm going to cut myself 2 of these lengths. I'm going to try and cut myself 2 of these lengths. There we go. And then I'm going to use a safety pin to feed the elastic through the channel. Once it's fed through, I will attach it with some zigzag stitches and then close up the little opening that I've left in the channel so that everything is finished nicely. So now that my sleeves are hemmed and the elastic is in, I'm going to sew them into the main body of the dress. And I'm going to sew them with a regular seam because I am going to finish off the armholes with the facing, which I'll show you how to do that in a minute. So we are going to pin our sleeves into our dress, right sides together. And you're going to match up the notches. Once the notches are all matched, you will then need to pull on the gathering threads for the sleeve cap to get the cap to fit into the armhole. Once that's done, we'll sew this at 5/8 of an inch. I have nested my underarm seams. So we've got the body of the dress going one way and the seam of the sleeve going the other way so that they nest. Then I have matched up the notch at the large circle with the shoulder seam, the other notches, and then I have just pulled the gathers so that the sleeve cap is gathered, and I've sewn that at 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to repeat that for the other side. You will have a line of gathering stitches visible. These will need to be removed, and I'm going to do that in just a second, but I am going to get the other side sewn in, and we're going to finish that seam off, as I say, with the facing, which I'll show you how to do once we've installed it. Kind of realised that I'm not really showing you guys the instructions for this, but that's because this dress is really simple. So I have got my sleeves in now, and actually sleeve seams are one that I don't press. I kind of leave them puffy because I prefer how that looks. But if you do want to press your sleeve seams, you want to do it after we've installed the facing. So we have got our neckline edge here, and we are going to install our facing with the right sides together. So you're going to match up the center front V, the shoulder seams, the back neckline, and the other shoulder seam, and there are notches as well, so we're going to match those all up, and we're going to sew that with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance from the front V all the way around to finish off the entire neckline. Once you've done that, we can then understitch, which I'll show you when we get there. So you should end up with something that looks a little bit like this. So we're going to need to clip up to, but not through, the point of the V at the front. You're going to want to clip into the curves around the back neckline and anything that has any kind of a curve in it. Once you've done that, we're then going to take the facing and all of the seam allowance, and we're going to understitch from the V all the way around, back round to the other side of the front of the V. So I'm going to, as I say, clip into and down to the point of my V, carefully, not cutting through the stitching line but up to it. I'm then going to clip into the curves around this back neckline just to release that so that it's all going to turn nicely. So I'm going to do that, and then I will understitch, and you're understitching the facing and all the seam allowance so everything gets pushed into the facing side, and we're going to understitch about 1/8 of an inch or a couple of millimeters into the seam allowance to then just make sure that everything rolls to the inside when we press it. Okay, so I have put in a row of understitching, and that has attached all of the seam allowance to the facing. So I'm now going to take this over to the ironing board, and I am going to press it with the facing side up, and you want to press it so that you're seeing just a tiny little bit of the outer fabric at the top here, and that's just going to help everything to stay to the inside. Once we've pressed it, we can then finish off the armholes. Okay, so I have pressed my neckline. Now the next thing that we need to do is finish off the arm seams here. So I am going to bag them out. So we've got the facing here on the, I've got to turn the dress inside out. So I'm going to turn under the seam allowance of my facing, and I'm going to pin it to the corresponding, I'm doing it at the shoulder seams, the corresponding seam allowance of the sleeve and the main body of the dress. So I've pinned it with the seam allowance underneath. So I'm reaching up through the facing and between the facing and the dress, and I'm going to kind of pull that over, and that pin, that holding pin that we've got in place, has allowed the seam allowance to all kind of be even with each other, the raw edges to be even with each other. So I'm going to take the pin out but keep everything pinned into place, because we then need to pin it with the right side of the facing to the wrong side of the sleeve and dress, and we're just going to keep pinning our armhole in place. Now this will get tight, and at some points you probably will have to do half a sleeve and then kind of come back and repin, but it's that first initial pinning of the seam allowance underneath that's important. So I'm going to pin this armhole into place the whole way around. So we've got the underarm seam, and again you're pinning that with the right side of the facing pinned to the wrong side of the sleeve. That's what we've got in there. So right side of the facing to the wrong side of the sleeve at the underarm section. I'm going to pin that in place, and then just keep going around and keeping the raw edges together. Just keep pinning the armholes together. This will fit because obviously we've drafted the facing from the main body of the dress. Just want to make sure that everything's lying nice and flatly. Okay, so I've pinned from the underarm seam to the shoulder seam, and I'm going to sew along the line of stitching that I've done previously, which attached the sleeve to the main body of the dress. Then I'm going to come and repin the other side and do the other side in the same manner. So once you've sewn in the first side, you're going to then need to readjust, and that's why we're doing it in 2 passes. So you kind of pull everything over to the other side, and it should be very obvious how this then gets pinned into place, because it should only be able to be pinned into place in one way. So I'm going to continue pinning the arm opening from the shoulder seam down to the underarm seam, and so this pass again following the line of stitching that we made previously to attach the sleeve to the dress. And then I'll show you how we get to this stage again on the other side, because I know this bit is a little bit confusing, but it will give you a really nice finish once we're done. Okay, so once you've sewn the second pass attaching the facing to the armhole, you should be able to turn it out so that the armhole is all enclosed, the raw edges are all enclosed within the facing. And once that's done, we then need to tack our facing to our side seams and our centre front and centre back seams as well, to help keep the facing in place. And this is what it should look like on the inside and then on the outside. So I'm going to do the same thing for the other side. So the first thing that you need to do, and I always have to do this because otherwise I get confused and I end up sewing a Mobius loop, which is the last thing that you want to do. So at the shoulder seam, you're going to turn under the seam allowance, and at the shoulder seam on the dress, this is the shoulder seam of the facing, you turn under the seam allowance. The seam allowance on the dress at the shoulder seam, you're going to turn that under as well, and you're going to pin those 2 folded edges together like this. Then you reach up between the facing and the dress, and you take that bit that you've pinned together and you make sure that all the shoulder seam allowances are lining up, and then you're going to pin from the wrong side, and you should have the right side of the facing to the wrong side of the sleeve. And then you just want to continue pinning around the facing, the raw edge of the facing to the raw edge of the armhole of the dress, from the underarm seam to the shoulder seam, and then you're going to sew that, readjust, repin, and sew the other side. You can technically do it all in one go, but it gets really fiddly, so I like to do it at 2 passes. So we're going to pin from the underarm seam all the way around to the shoulder seam, sew it along the line of stitching that you've done previously, and then we're going to repeat for the other side. So I've finished off my second armhole. I'm now going to go around and trim with my pinking shears close to the line of stitching, just to release some of the tension in this circular seam, and also to make sure that the edges don't fray too much. Technically they are going to be all enclosed when the facing is tacked down, but there are still raw edges in here, so I am, like I say, just going to pink the edges. I'm going to do that for both armholes. So once that's done, we then want to turn the facing to the inside and tack it down to the side seams, the centre front and the centre back seam. Okay, so I have tacked my facing down at the centre back, at the underarm seams and at the centre front. Now if you are following along with me, we still need to make the frill for the bottom of this dress, but if you like the dress with the high-low hem and the kind of like the length that it is, you could totally hem this dress now and it would be done. But I want to add on the frill at the bottom because I prefer the length it gives, and I also really like the extra fluff. So we shall hang this up and I'm going to make the frill next. So the selvages on this fabric aren't particularly nice, so I am going to French seam these strips together. I have 4 strips in total, so I have got them pinned wrong sides together, and I'm going to sew along here just so that I get rid of all of the white selvage fabric, and then we'll trim the seam allowance down, press it so the right sides together, and finish the French seam off with a 3/8 of an inch stitching line. So I'm going to get that done to create a circle out of all of the strips. As I say, I have 4 of them. Make sure that you have everything lying nice and flatly. You don't want any strips twisted because you will end up with a Mobius loop that you will have to unpick. Once you've sewn all your strips together, you should end up with a loop of 4 strips. You need to trim off the excess seam allowance like I've done here, and then we're going to take it over to the ironing board and press our seams with the right sides together so that we can then finish off the French seam with a 3/8 of an inch stitching line. So I'm going to do that for all of the different seams in this 4 strip loop, then we can hem it. I have finished my French seams and I have just pressed them all in one direction. Now I am going to hem this ruffle because it's going to be much easier to hem it as an independent thing rather than when it's attached to the dress and gathered up. So you want to hem the bottom edge, and I'm going to use the same method that I did for the sleeve. So I'm going to run a line of stitching just as a guideline around the bottom edge. I'm going to try and do it at a 1/4 of an inch, turn that up and up again, and then top stitch it into place. So I have hemmed the bottom of the frill or ruffle or whatever you want to call it. I'm now going to run 2 lines of gathering stitches, one 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge and another one 3/8 of an inch away from that, which will put the bottom stitching line visible on the garment. So you need to make sure that the garment or the fabric will recover from having holes put into it. I've got 4 panels of this ruffle. I'm going to run a line of stitching through 1 and 2 panels and then break it and then start again through the final 2 panels, so that I'll have 2 individual lines of gathering stitching, which will help make the gathering easier when we put it onto the dress, and also just in case anything breaks, it won't break the entire line of stitching and you won't have to redo everything. So I'm going to get both of those in now, and I'm going to use the largest stitch length on my machine, which is 6.0. I'm going to run the first line 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge, and then another one 3/8 of an inch away from that. I've got all the gathering stitches into the ruffle. Now we need to find the points that we're going to attach it to the dress. Now the front panels of the dress are actually wider than the back panels of the dress. So what I've done is I have put the front and back centre seam together, and then I have pulled the fabric taut so that I have found the 1/4 point, which is around about sort of 3 inches into the front panel from the side seam. So I've marked both 1/4 points with a pin. We've got 4 panels in our ruffle. I'm going to match up each seam with each 1/4 point, the centre front and the centre back seam, and then the 2 pins that I've put in that mark the quarter point of the side panels as well, which again is about 3 inches forward into the front panel from the side seam. And I'm going to match the ruffle and the dress together, wrong sides together, because I am going to French seam the ruffle into place. I can get away with that because this is a very lightweight viscose. If you're using a heavier fabric, you might want to think about binding the edge and sewing it with a regular seam. Once you've got your seams of your ruffle matched up with the centre front seam on the skirt, and then obviously the quarter point matched up to the seam, the next seam on the ruffle matched up to the quarter point, which, as I say, isn't quite the side seam on the dress part. We are then going to very gently pull on the gathering stitches in the ruffle to get the ruffle to come down to the same size as the skirt panel, and you want to just really gently pull on the gathering stitches, if I can untangle them all, to get them, like I say, to roughly the same size. And once you've got them to roughly to the same size, that's when you kind of start evenly distributing the gathers throughout that panel, because you want to get it to the same size first, and that might mean that you just really densely pull on the gathering until the panels are roughly the same size. So still got a bit to go. Add some more. Keep checking. So yeah, there we go. We've got the panel of the skirt is roughly the same size as the panel of the ruffle, but as you can see, I've got all the gathers concentrated in this area. So now that I've got them the same size, I can tie off my gathering threads and then start evenly distributing the fullness out into the bottom of that skirt panel. So I'm going to get that done for all 4, and then we can sew them with the beginnings of a French seam at 1/4 inch. I have the ruffle evenly distributed onto the dress, so I'm now going to sew that into place, and again we're using French seam. So I'm going to sew with the gather side up so I can make sure everything is behaving itself and lying nice and flatly. I'm going to sew at 1/4 inch all the way around, then I can then trim off the excess, press it and sew at 3/8 inch to enclose the raw edge. As I say, I'm going to do that the whole way around the bottom of the skirt to attach the ruffle to the dress. I have sewn the ruffle to the dress at 1/4 inch, and I'm now going to go around and very carefully trim off the excess, all the gathering threads, of which there are many, and any of like the fluffy edges that have happened from when I tore the fabric earlier. Once that's cut off, I can then go and press it with the right sides together so that I can finish off the French seam and enclose all the raw edges. I've trimmed all the excess off of the raw edge, and I have now pressed it with the right sides together so that I can finish off the French seam. I'm going to sew at 3/8 inch, which is going to be between those 2 lines of gathering stitches. So I'm sewing with the gathering side up again so I can make sure that everything is lying nice and flatly. That will finish off the raw edge on the outside. Once that's done, we can press it up to the main body of the dress, and then the dress itself will be done. So the dress itself is now finished. I still need to remove all the visible gathering threads, but the construction's finished. I do want to make myself a belt from the same fabric. So I have 2 pieces of fabric, the full width of the fabric, and they are 5 inches wide. I'm going to seam them together along one of the 5-inch edges, making sure that none of the selvage is visible. Then I'm going to press that seam open and then pin the long ends together and sew it into a tie, because I really like how this dress looks when it has some cinching at the waist. So I'm going to sew these 2 short ends together, press them open, and then pin it right sides together and sew all the way around the perimeter, leaving a tiny little opening so I can turn it through. Okay, so I have sewn the 2 pieces together and pressed the seam open. I've now got everything pinned with the right sides together. I am going to angle these points, so I'm going to start from where the selvage comes, backstitch there, go up at a 45-degree angle, and then I'm going to sew this at 3/8 inch all the way along. I am going to break the stitching. I have put in 2 orange pins, which means that I need to stop my stitching and start my stitching, so I leave this open so I can turn it through and do the same on the other side. So I'm going to get that done, turned through, pressed, then I'll need to slip stitch the opening closed, then we're nearly done. I have sewn the pieces together. Now I can trim off the excess, and I obviously want to trim close to the corners so that they will turn out nicely. That's one side done, and let's do the other. Okay. So as I mentioned, I've left a little opening here to turn it all through, so I'll just get rid of my excess thread and all the danglies. Not that these would ever get seen, but just neaten it up. Right, so I'm going to turn this through, and it's wide enough that I can get my fingers in, so I don't need to kind of like put a safety pin or anything in to actually get that done. So I just kind of push it all through and then pull it out from this end. Once that's all turned through, I'm going to go and press everything. I'll slip stitch the opening closed with a ladder stitch, and then I'll remove the gathering stitches from the dress, and I will try it on and show you what it looks like. I'm excited to see how this one's turned out because I do really like my burgundy coloured one. So it's going to be interesting to see how it comes out in a print. Let's get this done. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comments section down below, and I will try my best to answer them for you. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found the sew along useful. I always love seeing what you guys make, so if you do put something up on Instagram, remember to use the hashtag #ShawnMadeMeDoIt so that I can see what you have been up to. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!